Hello, my name is Mark Taylor. Welcome to the Education on Fire podcast network. This show is sponsored by the National Association for Primary Education. Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Season 5. Episode 76. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast, and as part of our PE season I'm joined today by Peter Cansell, who's, as you will know from previous seasons, is here as part of our education expert, almost like a consultant in terms of his experience as a teacher and a head teacher, and also he is the information officer for the National Association for Primary Education, who of course are now sponsoring the entire Education on Fire network, both in terms of this podcast, Learning on Fire, where I'm interviewing people who are living life on their terms and they're sharing their wisdom and expertise and with the younger generation, and also the actual NAPE podcast, which we're producing specifically for the organisation as well. So thank you for joining me, Peter.
Hi, Mark.
So let's first talk about your experience in terms of PE, both in terms of as a teacher and a head, and some of the things that you could share with our listeners.
Well, my background, Mark, is actually as a PE teacher, because when I qualified, my main subject was English, but my secondary subject was PE, and I worked in a middle school where I was used as a specialist PE teacher part of the time as well. And so I had quite a lot of experience of teaching PE to middle school children and then primary school children over the years. And I was very lucky that I was alongside people who were very thoughtful. One particular teacher who was really, really thoughtful about the way in which PE was taught. And we used to have really good, interesting conversations about the value of PE, and the value of PE not just as a sports-based thing, but about physical activity, about the impact of all those aspects of PE and sport which are valuable to life. And it was a really good education for me, and I've carried that with me throughout my career, and hope to convince children that PE is not just about being good at sport. It's actually got much more to it than that, and to help those children who don't enjoy sports to enjoy PE, and help those children who aren't able to take part necessarily. They might be injured or they might be ill or whatever, but still have an interest, and to make sure that they are involved and they are actively taking part in lessons and in the possibility of physical activity or sport.
I think that's really interesting, because having had our previous 4 episodes in this season, one of the threads that's come through is that whole idea about PE being about the whole child. It's not just about sport specific, it's about physical education, and also within that social education and all the external things that we can bring in as part of the whole. So I'm really interested that you were having those conversations. Well, it must be a few years ago now, as you're now retired. So is it gone full circle, do you think, or is it just the fact that this makes logical sense in order to support children, which of course is not based on a time or a period of time? That's just what children need.
I wouldn't say it's gone full circle. I would think that the people who think about these things have continued to carry those thoughts and still understand that. Sadly, there's a lot of evidence to show that it certainly hasn't gone full circle, because teachers have lost that capacity to teach their own, particularly primary school teachers I'm talking about, have lost the capacity to be able to teach their own class of PE because of the introduction of various things. It's one of those things of unforeseen consequences, isn't it? Because the introduction of PPA into schools, that's planning and preparation and assessment time for teachers, which is giving them non-contact time in primary schools, which didn't much exist before then. That bonus or benefit to teachers has been managed by schools often importing coaches to take PE lessons. In my view, there's certainly a difference between coaching and teaching, and so I'm not sure that that's a really good move. And in fact, I know it's not a good move to do that, and that's actually been barred now by the sports premium, the PE premium. The consequence of that was that teachers in primary schools often haven't taught PE, and therefore that aspect of the children's learning is not happening in the hands of a teacher, and that teachers become unskilled or de-skilled. And so I think that it's really sad that a lot of our primary teachers now need retraining and helping to become confident teaching PE. And I think that was one of the things that came out. I think Ryan Ellis was talking about that, about helping to train teachers to be more confident about teaching PE.
I think that's right, and I think actually, hopefully, over these last few episodes, you'll really get a sense of, if you are a teacher who wants to teach PE or is teaching PE, there are resources, and some of the people that we've interviewed actually can really support you in if you need a change of mindset, or if you need some facilities, or you need somewhere to start in terms of regrouping all these things. There's a lot of material out there, and it's very supportive to hear such passionate people, I think, who've actually spoken to me in these last few weeks.
Yeah, and I was really excited to hear people that shared views that I've held for a long time. People are really thinking about it, and it's, by its nature, sport is about winners and losers. Education is about winners. It's about inclusivity. Education's got to be about inclusivity. Sport, by its nature, is going to exclude people. And so you've got to bridge that gap, and PE is the perfect place to do it. It should be about physical education, not about sport, and that's always been the danger. And so there are. I sit on the board of something called a county sports partnership, and the discussion around that body, which is the body that helps to promote sport and physical activity throughout the county, but also monitors the use of the PE premium in schools on behalf of Sport England. That body moved away from being a county sports partnership, although they're still called that, to being the sports and physical activity body, and we've now changed our name again to become just about activity. And it's a really good shift in terms of thinking, people's thinking about physical activity being much broader than just sports. Because if you just confine PE to sport, then a lot of children will be lost. You've got to be wider than that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a really important distinction, which has been the strongest thing that's come out of this season, is the fact that PE and sport are not the same thing, and actually understanding the defining features are really, really key. The one thing that I didn't quite get to the bottom of in my previous conversations with people is where sport then fits in, or does it need to fit in at all within school? Because from my experience as a parent, I think that, as we've been talking about this season, actually educating children in physical education is great and the way forward and the most supportive thing for everybody. However, schools spend an awful lot of time after school, or even during school sometimes, going to events where there are five-a-side football, there's cross-country running, there's netball, there's basketball. And when they're into school events, often they just take a group of children who are picked across a range of abilities, and they go along and they have the experience of what it is to compete in a sporting event. And if they're not actually being given any sort of formal training in whichever sport it is they're going to actually take part in, I think that there's a certain amount of that where that's sort of detrimental, because they've got the physical education learning, but they don't have the sporting learning, and I wonder how that sort of fits in your thoughts in terms of the two things together within a school environment.
Yes, it's difficult. As a head teacher, it was very difficult for me to manage that, because I'm a passionate football person, and so I was always keen that our football team was as good as possible. But I was also very conscious of not wanting to exclude children that wanted to be involved, and so we always took the view that anybody that wanted to be involved in football could come to the football practices after school, would be involved. But it was always clear that we would pick the best team that we could, but I would try to make sure that everybody got an opportunity to play at some time. Very difficult to manage for schools, and you do get some schools that take the view, well, actually, it's got to be for everybody and it's got to be fair. And I applaud that. But there is still this element within sport and with other aspects of life where there is competition, where there is elitism. And we have a system in this country and in others where there is elitism in sport. Elite athletes go on to do things like Olympics and World Championships and so on, and so there's an inevitability that that's going to trickle down into schools. Managing that within the primary school, managing expectations and managing children's managing children's disappointment is a tricky one. It can be quite tricky. It's probably more tricky to manage parents' disappointment than it is to manage children's disappointment, I have to say, because it's often parents who have been shown in the past to be very, what's the word that I'm looking for? Perhaps passionate is the word, particularly on the touchline in football, or overcommitted to their child's performance. As a parent, I've also been there and seen, that desire to want to see my child do well. As an older parent, I've played football, five-a-side football in the same games as my son, and still do. I wouldn't dream of letting him beat me.
And I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I guess there are two things that spring to mind for me there. One is the fact that it's about communication. So if as a school your philosophy is, for this event, we're going to take a range of children with abilities and experience in this particular sport to give them an understanding of what that's like, then everyone knows that's the philosophy that the school may be using. And it may well be that they'll be up against the school, like you say, whose most important objective is to win, and therefore they will have been training and maybe doing after school clubs, and actually they're going to pick who they perceive to be the best people, and their objective is to win. And there's a different environment for each of those schools and those different experiences, and I guess so the expectation of what the school's trying to do in communicating that to the children and to the parents is probably the most important thing.
But you see, as a head teacher, you have a commitment and an obligation to those children who are the more elite end as well, because by being totally inclusive and saying it's more important to us to include everybody than it is to produce a team that wins, then those children who are really good, and I've experienced this with some of my footballers that we just had a cohort of children who got to a national level. I would have been doing them a disservice if I hadn't allowed them to blossom as well as they did. So there's always that dilemma. In schools we're always caught with this sort of difficulty, this area where you're trying to do the best for everybody, but you've got some who are going to do better than others. Some children will be better readers than others. Some children will be fantastic at playing a musical instrument. You would want to promote that. You'd want everybody to support that. And so what you're trying to do and build within the philosophy of the school is the feeling that everybody is striving to do their best. And that was what we would do, is we would say, in every aspect of school, we want everybody to be as good as they can be, and that allowed us to have children performing in various ways for others in the school, to inspire them and maybe say, look, it's not just about only that child does that, but it's there are all across the spectrum. There are children who can succeed in various ways, and you look for that so that others can be inspired to manage to be the best they can be as well.
And I think that the progression from that is the fact that, as you say, we all have individual skills, we all have individual talents, and that's where the whole idea of having a broad education spectrum within primary education is really important, because as you said, the more experience you get, whether it's within sport, whether it's within the music, whether it's within the arts generally, as well as just the more academic subjects, it means that somewhere within there you will, as a student, hopefully find something which speaks to you, and you can, the way that we learn and the way that we develop is to think, I like this gives me something, I want to put more time and energy into it. So it's time is obviously probably the biggest factor there, isn't it? Sort of within sport itself, if there was more time in order to be able to promote these things, then everyone would have more of a chance to actually progress at their level, whereas compared to the amount of time we have for maths and English, obviously PE is a lot less than that. But like I said, if you've got this broad education sense, then as we all do, you put and you get out as much as you can within the experience you're having, whatever that subject happens to be. And I guess that's, as you know, as a NAPE member, and what we talk about on the NAPE podcast, it's that kind of child first idea. And so that's why having this broad idea and a focus that we're just giving you the experiences and the knowledge you need to find who you are is a really important way of feeling, and that fits in within sort of everything we've been talking about, really.
Yeah, and for some children, it is only, possibly a performance area like being on stage, performing in some way musically or dramatically, or often in sport. There will be children that just do not manage to succeed in academic subjects, that they feel like a failure. But you put them on the sports field, and suddenly they can do it. And I've known certainly plenty of children who academically can't cope with what they're being asked to do for a variety of reasons, perhaps cultural background, perhaps because they don't have that capacity to relate to what's being taught, perhaps because of any sort of reason. But you put them on the sports field and suddenly they can do it. Well, what it tells me is that they have the intellectual and the cognitive capacity to do these things. It's just that's where it fits, and it's and so you need to give those children the opportunity to succeed, even if they're not succeeding academically. Sadly, our school system put so much emphasis on the academic subjects, particularly English and maths and science, that PE particularly and sport and physical activity get excluded from being a valuable thing. I think there was a conversation you had with one person in one of the interviews where they were talking about parents' evenings and saying, but it doesn't get discussed at parents' evenings. I think you were saying that, weren't you?
Yes, I did mention that. Yeah.
Yeah, that it doesn't. I don't recall often having conversations about PE with parents. It doesn't come up because you're so busy talking about the important things, so called. Like how they're doing in their reading.
And the other thing which I find interesting, and I think it's been supportive in some ways, is the fact that the introduction of, like you said, that there's the thing about having coaches coming in delivering PE, but I'm thinking more about the more wraparound idea where you have organisations and coaches coming in doing specific sport-related things, but either as breakfast clubs or after-school clubs. Because I think one of the most successful things that I've experienced as a parent with our children going through it is that in those environments, because they're sort of self-contained, they've been learning really good quality skills. I mean, they've opted in to do it. That's the first thing. So whether it's basketball or football or hockey or netball or whatever it happens to be, they've opted in. Week on week, they've been developing the skills and all the things they need to do that sport. And then these organisations have often then had holiday camps, or they've had inter-school competitions specifically for their organisation. And I think that's been incredibly successful because it's actually been specifically about the children wanting to do it and having the opportunity to do it and being given the skills to do it. And that's sort of like an expansion of PE within school, because it's slightly one step removed, but I think it's been a very positive one. My concern is that's great when you have parents who are able to support children to do these things, but it doesn't necessarily become an option for every child, and that's what I think primary education is really important, is to give every child those opportunities. And I'll be interested to hear what you think about that as well.
Yeah, I think that what you just described is exactly where the coaching aspect should be. It should be the after school clubs. It should be the additional activities that children have. There has been some what are called NGBs, national governing bodies, who have been very good in this respect. Lawn tennis has been one, have had a program that they had in schools. Rugby league had one, football had one as well at one point. Rugby union's done it as well, where they get local clubs and local coaches to come in and spend 6 weeks, half a term, say, coaching a class of children or coaching children during lessons or after school, or doing a day's coaching with children or a day's teaching with the children, and then an after school evening CPD for teachers to train them, to help them to get better at coaching the sport and teaching the sport. So I think there have been some really good initiatives in that respect, but not enough. And it seems to me down to the governing bodies of those sports to be more forward thinking in putting more resources into developing their sports in schools. But then you have inevitably the competition for time, and that's always a factor. You can't have everything, can't do everything. And, what we want for our children, of course, is for them to be well-rounded. We want them to be able to do a sport. We want them to be able to do a musical instrument, perhaps. We want them to be able to take part in a school play. We want them to be able to develop their artistic skills. We want them to develop their academic skills as well. We want them to develop the whole range of things. Education is, I keep on saying, education is bigger than just a school. It's bigger than just the school system. It's bigger than just the subjects that we teach. It's got to be a whole thing, a holistic approach. And what's important is to start with the individuals, the children, and develop the as much of them as we can, having a broad and balanced curriculum, and having a broad and balanced approach to school. I'm just thinking at the moment about the difference in what we have in school, and what we offer to children, which is a system, and what we should be giving them, which is a service, and the difference between those two things. And I think there's a critical analysis to be done there.
I love that analogy, and I love the passion of all of that. And this is the reason why I was really keen for NAPE to be involved as a sponsor of the Education on Fire podcast, because we're able to hopefully get out there and people to understand that through their work and the things that they're doing at various levels throughout education, that we can make as much of a difference as we can, and as we said before, the child first starting point. I know that you recently have been involved in conversation with ministers, and so that very sort of high level sort of policy and conversations about education generally can happen through an organisation like NAPE, and we can put these things forward going through the input that we're able to do on this Education on Fire podcast in terms of supporting teachers with different subject levels and ideas of things that are going in education in a very sort of natural way, and then supporting students and pupils themselves. The Learning on Fire podcast is the third part of this network. It's there specifically for maybe slightly older students as they get into their teens and adolescence, where they can actually hear some of the great wisdom and advice of people that are living life on their terms, that despite the system, despite what's going on, ultimately it's you as an individual, as you mature and you get older, that you can make decisions and put yourself in a position to live the life that you want to. And I think as a network, as a podcast network, as a sponsor, that NAPE's been involved with this complete sort of almost top-down and bottom-up approach of being able to cover all these things bit by bit in every decision we make, in every conversation that we have in all of these aspects, can make as big a difference to education and people individually as we possibly can. And that's the thing that I find really exciting.
Yeah, here. And the Learning on Fire podcast, which you've been doing, it just struck me as I was looking at it the other day, how those people that you've interviewed so far, how they have found their element, and they have found the right place to be. And I felt privileged that I have done that in education as well, and that if you're lucky, you do find the right thing in your life to engage with, and it makes life so much more enriched.
to round this up, what we were talking before about having this broad education, and having things like physical education being an integral part of what we're teaching in schools, so that if that's the thing that speaks to you most, you have the opportunity to learn those things. And actually, in terms of, as we've talked before on all of the seasons, about having space within the curriculum for people to breathe, to learn, to ask questions. The conversation that I had with Tony Yude, which I've put on the Nate podcast too, about the rehumanizing of education in terms of having space to, I think he talked about how conversations between sort of elders and pupils, in terms of having a sort of a back and forth conversation rather than the input of just knowledge and that kind of thing. All those things just give our children the chance to sort of learn and find their passion. And you're right, on the Learning on Fire podcast, it really was the sense that all these people have found a passion in a way to embed work and their passion together, which seems to be the key thing that binds them all together in order to sort of live life on their terms and in the way that they want to. And that's not necessarily monetary, it's not necessarily time, it's not necessarily environmental, it's a combination of how do I want to live my life, and it's different for everybody, and it's a combination of all of those things. And yes, as we start to grow and we start to expand the network and create more content for you, hopefully more and more of these things can come around like that, and you can actually feel that we're supporting you on all of these levels, as we said, from sort of the highest kind of educational elements, as it were, all the way through to the individual, and we'll be supporting you with ways for you to find your element, not just in terms of subjects, but also in terms of human skills and that kind of breadth of what it's like holistically, to be able to give you the strength that you need to really understand what you're about as a person, in terms of developing yourself as a teacher, but also whether it's you as a pupil or a student, whatever age you happen to be doing that. And as I said before, it's a very exciting time, and I look forward to how this all develops. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me with your PE hat on, Peter, this time, as well as being an integral part of NAPE too.
It seemed to go much wider than PE, didn't it?
as we often do. But hey, if people want to hear much more about these sorts of conversations, then the place to go is the National Association for Primary Education podcast, because we talk about all those things on there through education, people's experiences, and all the things that we're involved in. So I urge you to go and take a listen to that and subscribe to that as well. And yes, I look forward to chatting to you very soon.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.